songs and then start at the wrong pitch. They would say start higher or lower. Well, I would just start it louder. If they said higher, I'd start it louder. But that's kind of all I knew to do, and so I would go with it anyways. But I appreciate y'all that will come up here and lead singing, because that is one thing that scares me to death, to try to lead singing. And I appreciate y'all that will do it. So tonight I was going to talk for a few minutes. I won't talk too long, and try not to preach up a storm and get it snowing too much out here before we leave. I know we're kind of anxious to get home and just get in before we get a foot of snow and get up and go sledding tomorrow. That would be fun. I was telling somebody, coming from Colorado, we had some sleds and snow clothes, and we packed all our snow clothes up, but we left our sleds out. So hopefully we'll get enough snow to go enjoy our sleds anyways. We're kind of working off of what I said this morning, talking about how our mission is to show God to the world. One of the ways to do that is to listen to people. So that's why I want to talk about listening to understand, not listening to reply. And I think there's a big difference there, and we'll discuss that for just a little bit. But thinking about Jesus in that synagogue, when he was saying those things to them, when he started talking about and telling them the stories of the widow or of Naaman, wouldn't it have been interesting if they had said, "We don't understand what you're saying. Would you please tell us more about it?" Now it's interesting, when Paul was talking to the philosophers in Athens, some of them said that. They said, "We want to hear more of what you're saying about this unknown God to us." But wouldn't it have been neat if they had said that to Jesus? "Tell us more, because we disagree or we don't understand. We want to hear what you have to say." Instead, they tried to throw him off a cliff. So that's a pretty big reaction, and hopefully we don't get that far. But I want to start out saying, even with the first point of listening, not to people, to the Bible. Listening to the Bible. So in other words, studying. When you study Scripture, I just want to mention these two things. Number one, when you study, listen or study to learn, not to prove what you already know. That might make sense to you, it might not. But don't study just to prove what you already know. Because if that's what we go to Scripture for, to find what I think I already know, you're probably going to find that very thing in there somewhere. You may take it completely out of context, but you're going to find a sentence in there somewhere that seems to go along with what you think, if we just go to prove what we already know. And another one is, don't study the Bible in order to win a debate. Now, debates in their several years ago probably had their place and were a good thing. But as we know from watching political debates now, they're not really that good anymore for getting thoughts out there. So don't study the Bible to win a debate. Study the Bible to learn about God. And then once we learn about God, we can share that with people. But now, dealing with people, we'll get back to Scripture, but dealing with people, think about this: listening to people, not just to win a debate, or not to impress on them what you already know. Listening to people to actually understand. And the reason I say this is, like I said, going back to Jesus in the synagogue. If they had wanted to hear what he had to say, they would have listened. But the minute he said something that they disagreed with, they stopped listening. And we do that lots of times. In fact, if somebody says something that I disagree with, I start building defensive walls. Mental defensive walls, and it shuts down my hearing of what they have to say. If we're going to reach the world, we will be dealing with people who disagree with us a lot, and we disagree with them. And so if in our interactions with those people, if we just immediately build defensive walls and cause them to, no exchange, no communication will actually happen. So in this thought, it kind of goes along with the thought when we're trying to reach the world. It's not an us versus them mentality. It's an us serving them mentality. And that's what we need to have when we're trying to reach the world. But to clarify this, there's 4 points I want to make. And the first one, just to kind of help us, an exaggerated way to kind of help see this point. If any of you watched the presidential debate this last year, I didn't watch it, I read about it, but if any watched it, and I saw a few little excerpts to know enough that those kind of debates are not to have an exchange of ideas. Those debates are just to elevate oneself. That's what those debates are about, to elevate oneself above the other. Can you imagine if during those debates, if one of the candidates stopped and said, "Oh, that's a good point, I've never thought of that." That would never happen, would it? Nobody's ever going to stop in that debate and say, "Well, that's good, I've never thought of that, I agree with you on that." Because then it makes them look weak. And so you don't want to look weak, and so you have to try to talk down about that point and show how your point or your philosophy is better. That's elevating oneself over the other. We're about to read about that. But just imagine that in that exchange of trying to win a debate, not really trying to get the truth, just trying to elevate oneself over the other. And if we're not careful, we end up doing that in our relationships with each other and with the world. I'm going to read from James, the book of James, in two places. The first one is James chapter 1, 19 and 20. James 1, 19 and 20. "This you know, my beloved brethren, that everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." And it's a really neat way that James shows to say that. We need to be quick to hear, to listen to people, and slow to speak. So we listen more than we talk. Because when we reverse those, and when I'm barely listening to you and I just want to talk, that's because I have more anger coming out, or more wanting to prove myself or elevate myself and show my point and my philosophy. And what he's saying here is that kind of thought does not achieve the righteousness of God. Listening. And in our culture today, many times we reverse that and we think if I listen, then I'm condoning what they're saying and I'm showing us weak if I'm not immediately coming back with my point. And so I have to get my thought out there and say what I think and say what truth is so I can stand on the truth. But what happens when we do that is we completely alienate the person we're there to serve. We need to serve the person. And if we know anything from our culture, is that people need to be heard. Today, more than ever. There's so many outlets for people to speak and to say things, and they just need to be heard. Sometimes we just need to listen. Sometimes we need to hear what somebody's saying, even if we completely disagree with it, so that they feel heard and valued. When somebody feels valued, the defensive walls just fall down. And you can talk. You can share ideas and exchange. If we go first and listen. So with thinking about that debate, now I want to ask you, married people, have you ever had an argument with your husband or wife? Mark says no. Good job, Mark. Valentine's Day, he's never had an argument. We know, maybe we want to call them disagreements, okay? So we've had disagreements, and sometimes we've had very excited disagreements with our husbands and wives. But sometimes we've had arguments. And lots of times it depends on how you grew up as to how you argue. So you might grow up with a family that just hashes it all out right there, and then you might grow up with a family that they never talk about what they're really feeling. And so when those two people get married, it's kind of interesting, doesn't it? Sometimes we don't even know how to argue. But I bet most of us can relate to this. When you're having an exchange with your husband or wife, a disagreement, argument, and during that argument, subconsciously, you stop hearing what the other person is saying. While they're talking, you're formulating your response. You're trying to think of what you want to say. not even hearing what they have to say. So you might pick up on a word or two, and then you start trying to figure out how to prove that that was wrong, because somewhere in the argument, it just becomes about proving that you're right, not about reaching a point of peace. Now, I figure most of us have done this, because most of us do not enter marriage knowing exactly how to disagree with the other person in a very peaceful way. Most of us just don't. We have to work through that and get to a point where we actually listen to each other. And so think about this with our husbands and wives, or brothers or sisters. Listen, or parents and children. Listening instead of just trying to win the argument. That's a big point in this listening to understand, not just listening to be heard. So when we think about this with husbands and wives, it kind of, maybe you can relate to that, maybe not. But when a disagreement is happening, if the base of that relationship, that's based on love and serving, respect, and honor, then we should want to hear what the other person has to say, not just try to get them to hurry up and stop talking so I can say my point and prove that I was wrong. That happens a lot of times. Now, moving on to the next one. So, think about that, about the debate of promoting oneself, even in husbands and wives, that comes out, trying to promote oneself or one's philosophy or one side of the story over the other. And isn't it funny sometimes how a husband and wife can be saying, it seems like the same thing, but you're just not picking it up. It's just sometimes the wires are getting crossed. Well, now think about this with the world. Think about this with people that might be of a different race than you, or people that grew up completely different than you did. And they have a completely different perspective on the world. And you may disagree with that perspective, and they may disagree with your perspective. Now, what happens in our culture most of the time is one side starts shouting, and the other side starts shouting, and nobody ever hears what anybody's saying. And usually, the way our media will do it is they will try to paint one in a negative light or one in a positive light. But hardly ever anybody would just sit down at a table and say, let me hear your side. I want to hear how you grew up. I want to know why you've come to the point in life where you think like this. Because I truly value what you have to say. Most of the time that doesn't happen in our culture. Because that's kind of seen as weak. I'm weak if I want to listen to the other side. And even, it may be, seen, well, I don't want to be seen with that group or listening to that group because I don't want to be associated. Jesus was associated with a lot of people that the churchgoers looked down upon. They frowned upon Jesus for hanging out with certain groups of people. But when he hung out with those people, they felt heard. Think of Zacchaeus. He felt heard. He felt valued. He changed his life. Because Jesus would come to his house, tax collector, and Jesus listened to him. So there may be other groups and groups in the world that we need to hear. And then there's groups of people in the world, or lots of people in the world, that just don't know Jesus. And if we go to them and just try to debate them and win that debate, we may walk away from that feeling good about ourselves, but they walk away from it feeling defeated. And when you feel defeated, you don't feel very much value. You don't feel inspired. You don't feel served. You're just defeated. So we don't go to the world to defeat them with our Bible knowledge. We go to the world to serve, to love. And one of the best ways you can serve somebody is listening to you. That's why there's a whole industry of people that get paid just to listen to people. Because there's so much value in being heard. Many times when somebody actually listens, when you're saying things become so much clearer in your own mind. Just because somebody's actually listening to you now.
You get to hear yourself say it instead of hollering out so that you can defeat the other person. Listening is such a key thing in our lives. And I want to read from James chapter 3 as we close. So remember James chapter 1, 19, 20 talked about that being quick to hear and slow to speak. And now listen to what James says in chapter 3, verse 13. Who among you is wise and understanding? And let's stop there just for one. I'm going to read through. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now James says this after he talks about the tongue being fire. How the tongue, the things that we say, can start a whole forest on fire just by a little bitty spark. And then he says, now, after this, we need to listen more than we speak. And when we speak, we can really, really cause some damage. And then he says, who among you is wise and understanding? So think about that for a second as we're trying to teach the world about God. And we want wisdom. We want understanding. But when that wisdom and understanding is kind of parallel with the us versus them mentality, then as James says, it's kind of coupled with selfish ambition. And one of the definitions of selfish ambition is elevating oneself or putting one's own interest above the other. Isn't that what we do when we just try to win arguments? I'm elevating myself. I'm putting my own interest above the other person, either in a marriage or out in the world, or even with Scripture. If I just want to read this to prove that I'm right, so that I never have to admit, oh, I was wrong about that in Scripture, I'm elevating myself, not truly listening. So that selfish ambition can cause what James says is disorder and every kinds of evil. Now I want you to think about what you see on the news. What you see with all the riots that are going on, with all the different groups that have all their different platforms and how they all try to be heard. Disorder. Now I'm not just talking down about those people. But what I'm saying is lots of people in the world are not heard. And they're yelling very loudly. We need to be listening. We need to hear what people are saying. I didn't say you had to agree. We need to listen. Because if we listen, people will not have to scream so loud. We need to find a place with Christians, with Christ followers, where they can be heard and valued. Not just yelled back. Because as James says here, I'll read it towards the end. Notice what he says. But the wisdom from above, so I'm starting in verse 17, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. That's my encouragement for us tonight. Let the things that you say, and mostly your listening, be from people who make peace. Not that we always agree. Not that we have to say, yes, you're right, whenever we listen. But we need to listen. We need to listen to our husbands and wives. We need to listen to our children, and children need to listen to their parents. We need to listen to the people that we work with that have a completely different background than us, a different philosophy. We need to listen to the world so they feel valued, and so they want to listen to us when we tell them about God. We need to listen to Scripture. We need to listen to the words of Jesus, not based on what I already think, and not just trying to build up my knowledge so I can tear somebody else down with my Bible knowledge. We need to listen to Scripture to find out who God is, to find out who Jesus is, because that's who we need to be to the world. Danny's going to come and lead us in the song that he's mentioned. And if we, your family here tonight, can help in any way, we would love to, be glad to, but my main challenge is, when you go out this next week, try to be aware in your conversations. Are you listening? Truly listening? Or are you just trying